Rain pelted the cracked asphalt, washing away the colors of the world until everything looked gray and trembling. A small figure crouched under the skeletal remains of an old bus stop, her hoodie soaked through, face pressed against her knees, shivering and trembling. Beside her, a German shepherd puppy, fur slicked with rain, eyes wide and unsure, whimpered quietly, nudging her hand with a tiny, wet nose. Cars splashed past, indifferent to the trembling pair on the curb, their headlights slicing through the sheets of rain. From across the street, he watched. A man who had spent years teaching himself that control and distance kept pain at bay. His hands tightened around his umbrella, knuckles whitening, the sound of rain masking the thundering of his own heartbeat. In that instant, the world reduced to two lives huddled together in a storm he couldn't ignore. Logic whispered to call the police, to move on, to remain untangled from the chaos of strangers. But something in the curve of her small, tear-streaked face, the silent plea in the puppy's eyes, stopped him cold. He stepped forward, every step a defiance of habit, fear, and every rule he had ever followed. Rain fell like shards of glass, relentless and unforgiving, painting the city in streaks of silver and gray. The night air was heavy, soaked with the smell of wet asphalt and the faint tang of smoke drifting from a distant fire escape. He stood across the street, umbrella clutched awkwardly in one hand, feeling the cold seep through the wool of his coat. The sight of her made the world shrink to a pinpoint of urgency and fear. A little girl no older than 9 or 10, crouched beneath the skeletal remains of an abandoned bus stop, her hoodie plastered to her small frame. Beside her, a German shepherd puppy trembled, soaked and shivering, the soft whimpers almost lost in the symphony of the storm. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her knees, knuckles white, and her eyes, wide, glassy, too large for her face, stared blankly at the puddles forming around her. The rain ran in rivulets down the puppy's sleek fur, matting it, but he stayed pressed against her side, loyal, wary, the way only a young dog can be when it senses its human's fear. Cars zoomed past, headlights blinding, tires hissing through the water, indifferent to the tremors of life on the curb. He wanted to cross, to shout, to demand her attention, but something rooted him in place. Logic whispered that he shouldn't interfere. The city was cruel, strangers were unreliable, and yet some invisible thread tugged at him, pulling him forward against every calculated instinct he had spent years cultivating. He thought of the words he could say, rehearsed and safe. "Do you need help?" But the moment he opened his mouth, the syllables sounded hollow. How could words ever capture the weight of this sight, the raw vulnerability of the girl, the silent plea in the puppy's gaze? His chest tightened. There was fear, yes, but more than that. A strange, unfamiliar ache in his gut, like seeing something broken that you couldn't fix fast enough. He hated admitting how small he felt, but there it was, powerless to ignore the scene before him. Every droplet of rain, every distant honk, every splash of water seemed amplified, echoing in the hollow of his chest. The girl shifted slightly, hugging the dog closer, and he caught a glimpse of her face. Bruises shadowed her cheeks, faint but undeniable, and dirt streaked her skin. There was a trembling in her lip, barely visible, a quiver that spoke of exhaustion, hunger, and perhaps a fear deeper than the storm itself. Her eyes flicked to the street, then back to the puppy, as if searching for an anchor in a world that had offered none. He swallowed, realizing that calling the authorities, the safe, distant solution he had considered, felt suddenly like abandoning her in the middle of a merciless storm. A gust of wind slammed into him, tugging at his umbrella and forcing him to brace against the downpour. Water streamed down his coat, soaking through to his skin, but he didn't notice. The sound of the storm pressed against his ears, a constant roar that matched the frantic beat of his own heart. The girl flinched as a car sprayed water over the sidewalk, and instinct pushed him forward. One careful step, then another, until he was close enough that the rain soaked him entirely, but the distance between them, the barrier of her fear and his own hesitation, began to feel meaningless. "Hey," he said, voice low, hesitant, almost swallowed by the rain. She flinched, drawing the puppy closer, and he froze, remembering every warning his mind had offered. Strangers were dangerous, approach with caution, but he didn't feel danger here. He felt a fragility that demanded attention, demanded care, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't walk away. The puppy growled softly, protective but not hostile, nudging the girl's hand toward him, as if testing whether this stranger could be trusted. Her lips trembled, and for a moment she didn't move. He crouched slightly, trying to make himself less imposing, feeling the uneven cobblestones beneath his wet shoes. You don't have to stay out here," he said carefully. His words sounded inadequate, flat against the roar of rain and distant traffic, but they were the best he could offer. She tilted her head slightly, as though considering whether he was a threat, or perhaps considering if he was real at all, if someone could care without asking for anything in return. Minutes passed. The storm did not relent. He stayed silent now, letting the rhythm of his breathing sync with hers, letting the small vibrations of the puppy's body tell him that she was alive, that she was holding on. Around them, the city blurred, neon signs reflecting in puddles, the metallic taste of rain in the air, the smell of wet concrete and distant food stalls. He noticed her trembling shoulders, the way her hands gripped her knees, how the puppy's eyes darted toward him and then back to her, never leaving her side. His chest ached with an unfamiliar tenderness. Finally she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid I don't have anywhere to go." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories: hunger, fear, neglect, abandonment. He felt his throat tighten. Logic screamed at him to be careful, to maintain distance, to avoid entanglement. But empathy had already rooted him in place. He stepped closer, letting the rain plaster his hair to his forehead, letting the cold seep into his bones, and gently extended his hand. The girl hesitated, the puppy growling softly, body tense. Then slowly, her fingers brushed his. Not quite trust, not yet, but acknowledgement. That small contact, a single human connection in the midst of chaos, felt monumental. He realized then that he was no longer merely a passerby. He was a witness, and perhaps in some unexpected way, a guardian. The rain continued to fall, washing the city in shades of gray, but within that storm, a fragile warmth began to form. A shared presence, quiet and trembling, yet undeniably alive. He knew the first step had been taken. No sirens had sounded. No authorities had arrived. Just two lives on a wet curb, a little girl and her puppy, and a man who chose to step in rather than turn away. And in that decision, the world felt as if it had shifted ever so slightly, leaving space for hope, for connection, for something neither time nor storm could fully erase. The cafe door swung open with a sharp clang, letting in a gust of cold air and a spray of rain that carried the scent of wet streets and exhaust. He guided her inside, still gripping the small hand she offered, feeling how fragile it was, how tightly she curled around the tiny German Shepherd puppy tucked under her arm. The warmth inside hit him like a sudden tide. Steam from coffee machines, the subtle sweetness of pastries, and the low murmur of other customers, all blending into a cocoon of safety that the street outside had never offered. He hung his dripping coat on the nearest rack, shaking droplets from the umbrella, and she stepped hesitantly behind him, shivering, her soaked hoodie clinging to her like a second skin. The puppy whined softly, reluctant to leave the security of her arms. He crouched, whispering soothing words, letting the boyish excitement of the dog meet his calm presence. The girl's eyes flicked up at him, wary, studying his every motion, as if cataloging whether he could be trusted, whether safety was possible. He noticed the subtle tremble of her lips, the unevenness of her breathing, the way her shoulders seemed to carry weight far beyond her years. Every detail etched itself into his mind. He had never felt such a raw, immediate responsibility before, and the sensation was almost painful in its intensity. They moved to a corner booth, one far from the main traffic of the cafe, where the flickering warmth of a single overhead lamp pooled over the table. He ordered hot chocolate for her, black coffee for himself, and a small plate of muffins, the aroma mingling with the scent of rain-damp clothes, creating a strange domestic intimacy that felt foreign and yet utterly necessary. She watched him silently as he counted coins, the movement slow, careful, deliberate, as though any misstep might shatter the fragile trust forming between them. The puppy curled in her lap, ears flat, eyes wide, scanning every movement with protective vigilance. When he slid the hot chocolate across the table, she hesitated, fingers hovering over the cup before finally wrapping them around the warm ceramic. He noticed her wince slightly as the heat touched her hands, not from the temperature but from the unfamiliar sensation of comfort, of safety, a stark contrast to the constant cold and fear of the streets. The puppy licked her fingers cautiously, prompting a soft laugh that sounded brittle but real. He allowed himself a quiet smile, a small acknowledgement that warmth could exist, that joy could seep in through cracks he hadn't realized were there. They didn't speak much at first. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. Instead, there were glances, small gestures, him sliding the puppy closer, her adjusting the cup so her hands could fully feel its warmth, the soft sound of rain against the window, a gentle background to the silent conversation of two cautious hearts learning to trust. The city outside roared with indifference, but inside, time seemed suspended. Every drop of rain, every hum of the espresso machine, every scrape of a chair across the floor became part of a rhythm, a heartbeat that tethered them to a fragile, shared existence. She eventually spoke, voice trembling like the leaves outside in the storm. I didn't know where else to go. The simplicity of it struck him harder than any argument or plea could have. It was not a story, not a confession, just a bare acknowledgement of vulnerability, raw and unshielded. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice low, careful not to startle her. You don't have to be out there anymore. Not tonight. He wanted to say more, to promise permanence, to erase every fear etched into her bones, but he knew the weight of such words. They were unearned, fragile, like the puppy trembling against her side. She nodded slowly, eyes flicking to the puppy, then back to him. There was relief there, yes, but also hesitation, a caution born of too many nights spent wondering whether anyone could be trusted. He understood the look, the way she weighed his every gesture, the silent calculation of risk and safety. And in that understanding, a connection deepened, quiet but unmistakable. He realized that trust was not given. It was built, drop by careful drop, like the rain outside now thinning to a steady drizzle. Minutes became an hour. The girl ate cautiously, savoring the warmth of the muffin, the sweetness lingering like a promise she wasn't yet ready to believe. The puppy rested its head on her lap, eyes closing as if the comfort of warmth had begun to soothe its own long-held fears. He watched them both, feeling the strange, unexpected swell of something like hope, fragile and tentative, threading itself through his chest. He had not intended to care this deeply, and yet here he was, tethered to a life that was not his, yet now impossibly intertwined with his own. The cafe's low murmur of conversation became a protective hum, a buffer between them and the storm outside. He noticed the little details he had missed in the rain, the way her fingernails were chipped, the faint scabs along her knuckles, the way she inhaled sharply when she thought no one was watching. Each observation was a tether, a reminder of fragility and resilience coexisting in a single fragile body. The puppy stretched, curling closer to her as if insisting that safety could exist in the world, that warmth was not a betrayal but a right. He found himself speaking more, gently, cautiously, sharing little fragments of his own life that seemed mundane yet human, attempting to weave a tapestry of normalcy in the midst of the storm that had brought them together. She listened, eyes wide, occasionally smiling or tilting her head, absorbing the cadence of his words like sunlight after weeks of rain. The puppy's soft whines punctuated the silence, a reminder that even small creatures could feel fear and relief in equal measure. Time flowed differently in that corner of the cafe. He watched her slowly lower the protective walls around herself, encouraged by the safe, unhurried space. She began to speak in full sentences, small stories of days spent wandering, of nights under streetlights, of the quiet companionship of the puppy that had become her lifeline. His own heartbeat adjusted to her rhythm, to the quiet pulse of trust forming between them. It was delicate, fragile, but undeniable. Hours passed unnoticed until the storm outside finally began to ease, leaving the world outside wet but calmer, streetlights reflecting off puddles like tiny constellations. He realized he had been holding his breath, tethered to every movement, every reaction, every subtle shift in her expression. And now, in the soft glow of lamplight, he could see it, the first signs of a bond that might endure beyond the storm, a flicker of hope in her eyes, a tentative relaxation in the puppy's body, a subtle shift in himself, a willingness to step fully into a role he had never imagined he could occupy. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a quiet thought. Perhaps this was the moment everything could change, and though fear lingered, as it always would, it was tempered by something far more potent: presence, care, and the fragile yet unbreakable tether of trust formed between strangers who had found each other in the eye of a storm. The night settled into the city like a heavy, suffocating blanket, and the rain that had washed the streets clean now left them slick and shining under the glow of streetlights. He walked beside her and the German Shepherd puppy, the trio moving through alleys and quiet streets that smelled of damp brick and gasoline. Each step he took was measured, careful because he knew how fragile this world could feel to someone who had learned early that safety was an illusion. She kept close, clutching the puppy to her chest, eyes scanning the shadows like she expected danger to spring from every corner. And maybe she was right. The city had teeth, and they had to navigate them together. The wind cut through his coat, sharp and biting, and the girl shivered instinctively, pressing the puppy closer. He offered a blanket he had found in the back of his car, and for a moment, the two of them huddled together, warmth and fear intertwining. There were no words for the feelings swirling between them. The girl's lingering mistrust, the puppy's protective vigilance, and his own mix of fear, empathy, and reluctant hope. Every step they took was a negotiation with the past, hers mine, and his own, a silent agreement to move forward despite the shadows that clawed at the edges of their world. They found shelter in a small park, the benches slick with rain, leaves clinging to the ground in soggy patches. The girl perched on one of the benches, the puppy curling in her lap, and he sat beside her, careful to leave space, careful not to frighten her. The silence was heavy, but it was also a shared one, not empty, but full of unspoken recognition that they were navigating this darkness together. The wind rustled the trees, and in that soft, persistent sound he could hear the rhythm of her fear, the pulse of her heartbeat, and the small, trembling life of the puppy. He realized that this moment, like all the moments before it, was about more than protection. It was about presence, about acknowledging the reality of pain without pretending it could be erased in a single gesture. A siren wailed in the distance, cutting through the night like a blade, and the girl flinched, clutching the puppy tighter. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke, trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I don't want them to take me." He understood instantly. It wasn't just about authority, or rules, or law. It was about a lifetime of small betrayals, of adults who promised safety and delivered harm instead. He placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle, grounding, careful not to overstep. "No one is taking you tonight. Not me, not anyone. You're safe here." The words felt heavy and inadequate, yet he spoke them anyway, because silence would have been worse. They moved again, stepping carefully through puddles, their reflections broken and distorted by ripples and streetlight glare. The city seemed almost hostile in these hours, empty alleyways, flickering lamps, shadows that seemed to linger too long. But as they walked, the girl began to loosen her grip slightly on the puppy, eyes flicking up to meet his once or twice, as if testing whether the trust forming between them could survive the darkness. And every time she looked, he offered nothing but steady presence, no judgment, no pity, only the unspoken promise of safety and consistency. They found a small 24-hour diner tucked between brick buildings, neon flickering above the door in harsh reds and blues. The smell of fried food and coffee hit them immediately, strong and grounding. Inside, they claimed a booth in the corner, away from the few other patrons. The girl let the puppy down, and it padded to the edge of the booth, sniffing the floor before curling back against her legs. He ordered 2 bowls of soup, the steam rising in gentle curls, carrying warmth not only to their bodies but to the fragile bond forming between them. She ate cautiously, spoonful by spoonful, while he watched her, noting every hesitation, every small sigh of relief as the warmth spread through her hands and chest. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, voice low, carrying the weight of years of disbelief. He paused, considering the answer. "It wasn't heroic. It wasn't moral. It was human. It's because you're here," he said softly. "And because right now this matters. That's enough." She tilted her head, studying him, eyes bright and wary, and for the first time he saw something that resembled hope flicker there, as delicate as the steam rising from their bowls. After eating, they stepped back into the night, streets quieter now, the storm fully past, leaving a slick shine on every surface. He noticed her footsteps beside his, hesitant, unsure, yet gradually more confident. The puppy ran ahead briefly, then returned, circling them both in a protective orbit. There were moments when she glanced at him, a fleeting connection of acknowledgement and trust, before retreating into her own thoughts. Shadows still lingered, both around them and within her, but they were beginning to shrink under the weight of shared presence, small gestures, and quiet care. At a narrow bridge overlooking a darkened canal, They paused. The water mirrored the fractured light of street lamps, rippling with the faint movement of wind. The girl leaned against the railing, the puppy resting at her feet, ears twitching at every sound. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "I don't think anyone's ever stayed, even for a little while." He didn't answer immediately. He only watched her, letting the words hang between them, heavy and unclaimed. Finally, he said, "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." She turned slightly, eyes wide, searching his face for deception, for hidden motives, for a reason to retreat. Finding none, she relaxed, just enough for the night to feel less threatening, for shadows to feel smaller. He felt it too, the subtle easing of tension, the fragile breath of connection that could grow into something unshakable if nurtured. The bridge became more than a crossing over water. It became a threshold between fear and possibility, between isolation and the fragile beginnings of trust. They continued their walk through the quiet streets until they reached a small apartment building where he had arranged a temporary place for the night. She hesitated at the threshold, puppy in arms, and he knelt to meet her gaze. "You don't have to decide everything tonight. Just step inside, breathe, and we'll take the next moment together." She nodded once, barely perceptible, and together they crossed the threshold. Inside, the warmth was immediate, radiators humming, faint smell of old wood and fabric, the soft glow of a single lamp. The puppy padded around cautiously, exploring, then returned to her lap, its small body a tangible reassurance. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to relax fully. Not completely, not forever, but enough to feel the absence of immediate danger, enough to begin imagining that safety could exist, even if fleeting. He watched her, felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, but also the strange, unfamiliar sense of fulfillment. He had crossed shadows of fear, both literal and metaphorical, and arrived on the other side with a fragile human connection that neither time nor distance could easily sever. And as the night stretched on, with the city silent beyond the walls, he realized something he hadn't expected. The smallest acts of presence could cast the longest shadows of hope. Morning crept in slowly, pale and hesitant, filtering through the thin curtains like a quiet promise. The apartment smelled faintly of last night's rain, old wood, and the lingering warmth of a small heater, the faint aroma of leftover soup clinging to the air. The girl was awake first, sitting on the edge of the bed, the German Shepherd puppy nestled against her legs, ears twitching at every sound. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, yet alert, scanning the room as if memorizing every shadow, every corner, every potential danger. For a long moment, she said nothing, just breathed, listening to the soft hum of the city outside, the subtle shift of light across the walls, the comforting presence of the man who had become her guardian, however temporary it might seem. He stirred from the couch where he had slept lightly, waking to the soft warmth of morning and the quiet observation of a child whose trust he was only beginning to earn. He watched her, noting the way she held the puppy, careful not to let it slip, careful not to let herself slip into the fragile comfort of safety too quickly. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, heavier than he had expected, yet in that pressure there was also a strange, exhilarating clarity. He realized that this morning, this small stretch of time bathed in soft light, was a moment of rebirth, fragile and fleeting, but utterly real. They moved together through the apartment, the puppy padding behind them with a cautious curiosity, sniffing corners of the floor and each of their shoes. The girl's small movements were deliberate, not the reckless gestures of a child who felt secure, but the calculated, careful motions of someone who had survived too much to take safety for granted. He offered breakfast, simple toast and eggs, and watched her eat in silence, noting the way she handled the food with tentative care, savoring it as though every bite were a gift, a privilege she had almost forgotten existed. The puppy nuzzled her leg, occasionally glancing up at him with dark, soulful eyes that seemed to communicate trust in its most basic, unspoken form. By mid-morning, the sun had begun to pierce through low-hanging clouds, scattering warm light across the streets below, turning puddles into mirrors of fleeting gold. He suggested they take a walk, a small excursion to reacquaint themselves with the world outside, and she hesitated, eyes darting toward the door, weighing the unknown beyond the apartment walls against the safety of this temporary haven. Finally, with a deep breath, she stood, the puppy leaping eagerly beside her, tail wagging cautiously. As they stepped outside, the warmth of sunlight on wet skin was strange and almost painful, but also invigorating. a reminder that the storm had passed and that light, however tentative, could reach them even here. They walked slowly, carefully, the street still slick and glimmering, but alive in a way that had been absent the night before. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a nearby schoolyard. Cars splashed through puddles with soft murmurs, and the scent of fresh bread from a bakery drifted toward them, mingling with the faint scent of wet asphalt and distant flowers from a neighbor's balcony. The girl's eyes widened at the sensory overload, her fingers curling instinctively around the puppy's fur. He watched her, noting the subtle changes, a small smile, a tilt of the head, a soft exhale that suggested the tiniest but real relaxation. At a small park, they stopped by a fountain, water trickling over worn stone, sunlight glinting off droplets like scattered diamonds. The puppy padded forward, nose twitching at the scent of grass and earth, and the girl followed, laughter bubbling from her lips as the tension of the past days began to loosen. She tossed a small stick, the puppy racing after it with joyous abandon, and in that moment the barriers between them, the girl, the dog, and the man who had become their protector, seemed to dissolve. There was no fear, no calculation, only presence, and the pure, almost shocking freedom of a child allowed to exist in the light without constant vigilance. He spoke then, softly, gently, telling stories of mundane things, the city's hidden corners, small wonders, everyday kindnesses. She listened, wide-eyed, occasionally interjecting with questions or small insights, her voice growing stronger with each syllable. The puppy barked happily at pigeons scattering near the fountain, and she laughed again, a sound that was bright and startling in its authenticity, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He realized then that this bond, fragile, tentative, yet undeniable, was teaching him as much as it was teaching her, how to care fully, how to trust, how to allow warmth and light into spaces long held in shadow. As the day stretched on, they returned to the apartment, carrying small treasures from their walk. A smooth stone, a pressed flower, a stray feather, little symbols of the world beyond the storm and the shadows. They arranged them carefully on the windowsill, sunlight glinting off the collection, a testament to resilience, to survival, and to the beginnings of hope. The girl traced the edges of each object with her fingers, small movements of wonder and reverence, and the puppy lay at her feet, a steady presence, a bridge between fear and the light. That evening, they cooked a simple dinner together, a quiet ritual of shared effort and laughter. The puppy lay on the kitchen floor, watching every movement, occasionally nudging a foot or paw as if offering encouragement. She spoke more freely now, telling small stories of her life, each memory tinged with sadness yet balanced by a growing sense of security, of the possibility that someone could care without asking for anything in return. He listened, sometimes offering advice, sometimes simply holding space, letting her words and the weight behind them fill the room with both truth and hope. As night approached, the glow of streetlights outside mingled with the soft lamplight within, casting gentle shadows across the apartment. The girl curled up on the couch, the puppy nestled beside her, and he sat in a chair nearby, watching them both with a mixture of awe and humility. For the first time since he had found them in the storm, he felt something shift within himself, a recognition that light could exist not just outside, but inside, in moments of trust, connection, and shared presence. And in that quiet, ordinary evening, he realized something profound. The storm had passed, but the work of healing was only beginning. Shadows lingered, past fears and scars not yet erased, but they no longer ruled the space between them. They had crossed into the light together, step by careful step, and in doing so, had discovered that safety, warmth, and hope were not illusions but possibilities. Fragile, yes, but achingly real, waiting for the courage to claim them. The morning light fell gently through the apartment window, soft and golden, carrying the promise of a world that no longer felt hostile. Outside, the streets glimmered with dew, and the scent of fresh earth mingled with the lingering aroma of breakfast and the faint, comforting scent of the puppy now sprawled contentedly across the floor. The girl moved quietly, careful not to wake him, her fingers brushing the warm fur as she traced patterns in its coat. The simplicity of the moment, the warmth, the quiet, the unspoken connection, was a revelation. For the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to believe that she could belong somewhere, that she could be safe, that she could be seen. He watched from the kitchen doorway, a mug of coffee warming his hands, and felt the strange, satisfying ache of relief and pride. The journey they had shared, the rain, the shadows, the quiet nights of cautious trust, had brought them here, to a place where light felt natural rather than rare, where love could exist without conditions. The puppy yipped softly, chasing a stray sunbeam, and the girl laughed, a sound that was bright and ringing, a melody that seemed to lift the room itself. He realized then that these small, ordinary moments were the most extraordinary of all, proof that even in a world that could be cruel, tenderness could endure. They walked through the city streets later that morning, the sun warming their backs, the pavement dry and glistening, reflecting everything in a clarity that had been absent before. She held the puppy's leash tightly, steps tentative but steady, while he walked beside her, alert, protective, yet careful to give her space to navigate the world on her own terms. Every glance she cast around her, every curious pause was a test and a celebration. She was learning to trust not just him, but life itself, and in that act of courage, she was teaching him as well. They stopped at a small park where flowers bloomed along the paths, petals vibrant in the morning light, bees buzzing lazily from bloom to bloom. The girl knelt to touch the soft petals, brushing them gently between her fingers, her eyes alight with wonder, and he felt a pang of something deep and tender, the recognition that this simple joy, once unimaginable, was now hers to claim. The puppy barked happily, chasing a butterfly that fluttered past, and the girl's laughter followed, spilling into the air like wind through chimes. He allowed himself a smile, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly, carried away on the currents of trust and growth that had taken root between them. As the day progressed, he noticed the small but profound shifts in her demeanor, the way she held her head higher, the way her steps were less guarded, the way she spoke freely without hesitation. The puppy mirrored her confidence, tail wagging, ears alert, and together they formed a small constellation of trust, resilience, and hope. Each interaction was a testament to the power of consistent presence, of quiet care, of letting someone, no matter how small or wary, feel seen and valued. He realized that the journey they had shared was not just hers to traverse, but his as well, and that in lifting her, he had found a way to lift himself from the shadows he had carried for years. Evening approached, painting the city in amber and gold, and they returned to the apartment. The girl set the table for a simple dinner, the puppy padding around her feet, and he watched, noticing every detail, the way she arranged the plates, the care she took to pour water, the quiet pride that shone in her eyes. There was a rhythm to the room now, a harmony born from trust, shared space, and the deliberate acts of care that had slowly transformed their lives. He helped her cook, laughing softly at small spills, letting her lead the conversation, encouraging her voice and marveling at how much life could be contained in these ordinary human moments. After dinner, they settled on the couch, the puppy nestled between them, warmth spreading through the three of them like a quiet, unstoppable current. She leaned against his shoulder, tired but content, eyes half closed, and he felt the weight of every fear, every storm, every shadow of the past ease into the stillness of the room. Outside, the city hummed softly, streetlights glowing like sentinels, the faint rustle of leaves carried on a gentle breeze. He realized then that their lives had shifted irreversibly. What had begun as a night of chaos and uncertainty had blossomed into a dawn of connection, hope, and the quiet assertion that love, even tentative, fragile love, could endure. He thought of the world beyond these walls, of the nights spent in fear, of the indifference of strangers, and he understood something profound. The moments that truly define us are not always those of grand gestures or heroic acts, but of the quiet insistence to be present, to care, and to allow light to seep into the cracks where shadows once held sway. The girl stirred, hugging the puppy tighter, and he felt the full, aching beauty of the bond they had forged. It was fragile, yes, but unbreakable in the ways that mattered most. As darkness fell outside, the apartment glowed softly, cocooned in warmth and quiet reassurance. She looked up at him, eyes bright and trusting for the first time, and he realized that this was the ultimate measure of their journey. Not perfection, not safety guaranteed forever, but the courage to face life together, to share space, to offer care without reservation. He reached down, gently brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and she leaned into the touch, a silent acknowledgement that this moment, this connection, was enough. Finally, as night deepened, they moved to the window to watch the city lights reflect off wet streets and puddles, each flicker of neon and lamplight mirrored in the stillness below. The puppy rested at her feet, ears twitching, eyes half closed in contentment. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I think I'm going to be okay." He nodded, voice low, filled with quiet reverence. "Yes, you are." And in that simple exchange, every storm, every fear, every shadow of the past seemed to dissolve, leaving only the soft, persistent glow of connection, trust, and the quiet triumph of hearts willing to open despite everything. The rain had gone, the darkness receded, and the city, vast and indifferent beyond the window, now seemed a place of possibility. And in the center of that ordinary, yet miraculous moment, they remained. A little girl, a German shepherd puppy, and a man who had chosen to stay when leaving had been easier. The echoes of change were not loud, not dramatic, but they were there, resonating in every heartbeat, every laugh, every gentle touch, proof that even in a world built on shadows, light could find its way, persistent, unyielding, and transformative.